Please subscribe to this channel for more videos related to Catholic Christian teaching. The doctrine of original sin was rejected by the Gnostics and Manichaeans, who believed that the moral corruption of humanity comes from an eternal principle of evil, and also by the Origenists and Priscillianists, who explain humanity's inclination to evil by a pre-corporeal fall through sin. Original sin was directly denied by the Pelagians, who taught that the sin of Adam is transmitted to posterity not by inheritance, but through limitation of a bad example. Death, suffering, and concupiscence are not punishment for sin, but a natural condition of man who was created in a pure state of nature. The baptism of children is administered not for the remission of sins, but as a sign of their reception into the Church and admittance into life eternal, which is distinct from the kingdom of heaven. The Pelagian error was combated chiefly by St. Augustine and was condemned by the Church at the synods of Milevis, Carthage, Orange, and in later times by the Council of Trent. In medieval times, the Synod of Saints rejected the following thesis of Peter Abelard: "From Adam we have not contracted guilt, but only punishment." The Reformers, the followers of Bayes and the Jansenists, admitted the reality of original sin, but misunderstood its essence and its operation, since they regarded it as identical with concupiscence, which completely corrupts human nature. The Pelagian error lives on in the rationalism of modern times to the present Socinianism, rationalism of the age of the Enlightenment, liberal Protestant theology, modern unbelief. Rationalism regards reason as the chief source of knowledge, in contrast to the other possible sources of knowledge, such as faith, tradition, or sensory experience. Socinianism is a 17th century theological movement professing belief in God and adherence to the Christian scriptures, but denying the divinity of Christ and consequently denying the Trinity. The dogmatic teaching on original sin is laid down in the Tridentine Creed Super Peccato Originali, which in part follows word for word the decisions of the synods of Carthage and of Orange. The Council of Trent rejects the doctrine that Adam's laws of sanctity and justice received from God was merely for himself alone, and not for us also, and that he transmitted to his posterity death and suffering only, but not the guilt of sin. It positively teaches that sin, which is the death of the soul, is inherited by all his posterity by descent, not by imitation, and that it dwells in every single human being. It is removed by the merits of the redemption of Christ, which, as a rule, are bestowed through the sacrament of baptism on adults as well as on children. Therefore, children are also baptized for the forgiveness of sins. The Old Testament contains references to original sin. For behold, I was conceived in iniquities, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Who can make him clean that is conceived unclean? Both passages speak of an inborn sinfulness, whether this be understood in the sense of habitual sin or merely of the inclination to sin, but do not bring this into causal connection with the sin of Adam. The causal connection between the death of all mankind and the sin of our first parents is, however, clearly stated in the Old Testament. The classical passage is Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 21, in which the apostle draws a parallel between the first Adam, from whom sin and death are transmitted to all humanity, and Christ, the second Adam, from whom justice and life are transmitted to all men. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into this world, and by sin death, and so sin passed upon all men, in whom all have sinned. For as by the disobedience of one man many were made sinners, so also by the obedience of one many shall be made just. Death is expressly distinguished from sin and is represented as the consequence of sin. Concupiscence is not meant because sin is removed by the grace of Christ's redemption, while evil desire remains as experience shows. Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. For just as through the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so through the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. The words in quo in Romans chapter 5 verse 12 were understood by St. Augustine and all of the Middle Ages in a relative sense of unum hominem, by one man in whom all have sinned. The better founded causal sense, already proposed by the Fathers, especially by the Greeks, came into the fore, on the ground that all have sinned, or because all have sinned. The words many were made sinners in Romans chapter 5 verse 19 do not limit the universality of original sin. Since the expression many in opposition to the one Adam or Christ is parallel to all in Romans chapter 5 verse 12 and Romans chapter 5 verse 18. St. Augustine appeals to the tradition of the Church against the Pelagian bishop Julian of Eclanum. It is not I who invented original sin, which the Catholic faith holds from of old, but thou who denies it, thou art without doubt a new heretic. St. Augustine adduces a formal proof from tradition in which he quotes influential fathers as witnesses to the Catholic teaching. Many assertions of the Greek fathers who insist on personal responsibility for sin and appear entirely to separate from original sin are to be understood as being in opposition of Gnostic Manichaean dualism and to origenistic pre-existentism. St. Augustine defended the teaching of St. John Chrysostom against its misinterpretation by the Pelagians. He spoke in a more secure manner before your quarrel started. Irrefutable proof of the conviction of the primitive church as to the reality of original sin is the old Christian practice of the baptism of children for the remission of sin. The doctrine of original sin cannot be proved by natural reason. Nevertheless, the fact of original sin is evidenced by many signs. Certain signs of original sin shine forth with probability in the human race. Such signs are the frightful moral aberrations of humanity and the many lapses from belief in the true God, such as polytheism and atheism. Please go to YouTube Retirement channel, playlist Divine Act of Creation by the complete series of these materials.